Welcome back to the Way of the Lion Narnian Apologetics course. This is part 2 of the section on the silver chair. Part 1 was a little depressing, since we only talked about the spell that modern society has us enthralled to, with particular reference to the tactic of Bulverism, as employed by Feuerbach, Freud and Marx and their disciples. This time should be more hopeful and uplifting, since we're dealing with how to break that spell. Our learning aims in this session will be to consider Puddleglum's refutation, to apply it to contemporary spells, and challenge some preconceptions about Christianity. Let's start with Puddleglum. In the scene we considered last time, with the debate between the freed Rillian, the English children, Puddleglum and the Queen of Underland, we saw that she employed smoke and music in her magic. In order to break the spell, Puddleglum decided to first break the smell. He walked over to the fire and put his foot in it, literally. This also had the effect of stopping the constant thrumming of the witch's mandolin and the sound of her voice, since she showed her true colours and screamed horrible threats at the injured Marshwiggle. Lewis wrote in The Problem of Pain, page 91 of my copy, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Certainly it roused Puddleglum, since he was now able to counter the witch's claims. It is important to note here that his manner was unimpeachable at this juncture. In response to a woman who had murdered his queen, enslaved and bewitched his prince for 10 years, and had just tried to do the same to him and his friends, he responded to her respectfully, courteously, but resolutely. I suggest that it would be wise to replicate this in our conversations with people who constantly blaspheme the things we hold most dear and slander us and our church family. The only way I can see to do this would be to remind yourself at every blasphemy they utter that they are made in the image of God, in imago Dei, and he loves them enough to have died for them. So they should be respected, but courteously corrected. Puddleglum's principal response was not to appear to objective reality, as the others had been bested on. Scrub was told his meeting with her in the overworld was a dream. Jill had been convinced that the other world containing England was all a dream. Rillian had been beaten on the matter of the sun being just a lamp imagined bigger and better. His argument was one from desire. I quote from chapter 12. One word, all you've been saying is quite right, I shouldn't wonder. But I'm a chap who always like to know the worst and put the best face I can on it. So I won't deny any of what you've just said. But there's one thing more to be said, even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars, and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. That's a funny thing when you come to think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. There is a common error made when people discuss Narnia. They say that it is allegory. This is entirely false, as Lewis himself was at pains to point out in various essays and letters. It is instead supposition. Suppose there were a world where animals talked and trees danced. What would Jesus look like there? Maybe like a great lion, the king of beasts. Suppose magic existed. What would Christianity be, but deeper magic? Suppose sin were personified. How would it act? Perhaps by offering great reward for something sweet like Turkish delight, only to throw you into prison or turn you to stone. Puddleglum uses this suppositional method in his phrasing of the argument from desire. This argument is put more clearly in Mere Christianity, Book 3, Chapter 10, The Christian Way. I quote, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and, on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy, or echo, or mirage." Elsewhere, Lewis calls this idea Sehnsucht. That was the end of the quote. Elsewhere, Lewis calls this idea Sehnsucht, or longing after joy. Translated to the Christian faith, this tactic is not mere Freudian wish fulfillment, as a chap suggested to me on Facebook. I quote, "If we really want something to be true, we should believe in it, whether there's any evidence for it or not. Ha 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 ha." Philosopher Alvin Plantinga shows the other side of this assumption in his book Warranted Christian Belief. I quote, "Many people," I should do this in an American accent, but all my American accent ends up sounding like I'm quoting the shooting of Dan McGrew. "A bunch of the boys were whooping it up in the Malamute Saloon." I'm not going to do that. Many people thoroughly dislike the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient being monitoring their every activity, privy to their every thought, and passing judgment on all they do or think. Others dislike the lack of autonomy consequent upon there being a someone by comparison with whom we are as dust and ashes, and to whom we owe worship and obedience." End quote. It follows on from the thought of St. Augustine, Pascal, and William James, where the wish is upgraded to an inherent need for God, or a God-shaped whole. Having mentioned Pascal, we should note that Puddleglum's next step is to appeal to a kind of Narnian Pascal's wager. French philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote in his Pensées, "Belief is," I quote, "belief is a wise wager. Granted that faith cannot be proved, what harm will come to you if you gamble on its truth and it proves false? If you gain, you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he exists." End quote. Puddleglum attributes values to the witch's reality and to the Narnian reality. Since there is nothing of value in the witch's hollow world, and the value of living as a Narnian is so great, it would be a small loss to spend life focused on the things above. Though I consider Pascal's wager to be a lazy apologetic, the logic of it holds true. Everything to gain, nothing to lose, though risking everything by not speculating. So, what spells do we find ourselves under today? Put another way, what things are accepted without investigation? In particular, we are thinking about university-aged people in their late teens or early 20s who have imbibed Bulverism throughout their education and are now able and free to assess their beliefs. The second question of crucial importance is, how can we challenge them? Last time I suggested 3 fields which we can continue to consider: Feuerbach's epistemology, Freud's psychology, and Marx's economics of oppression. Last week we examined what these thoughts were, and this time we are going to consider how to present an alternative model with greater explanatory scope and power. Let's begin with epistemology. Epistemology is the study of how we come to know things, or the study of knowledge. Feuerbach stamped his atheistic faith on this discipline, but prior to him, this was a field nearly dominated by Christian thought, including Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, Occam, he of the razor, and Descartes. The downside to this was a sort of intellectual complacency amid the church, so that when the trials and scrutiny came to Christianity, the defenders were too few and ill-prepared to counter the onslaught. This attack, coupled with textual skepticism, decimated the church and left it reeling, and it has not yet recovered. This was one of the factors which led to the evils of postmodernity. When we point out today that none of the heroes of the scientific revolution were atheists, or we point to the great fathers of modern science such as Sir Isaac Newton to demonstrate Christian foundations, the frequent comeback is, of course they were Christian, nearly everyone was back then. This avoidance of the issue at hand is symptomatic of Bulverism. The Narnian apologist can counter this anti-intellectualism by showing rigorously tested evidence, proving the foundation of our faith to be firm facts, not fluid feelings. The foundation of our faith to be firm facts, not fluid feelings. The foundation of our faith to be firm facts, not fluid feelings. Sorry, I just like that. Psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning spirit, soul, or butterfly. The last meaning is probably not relevant. It has come to mean, in the modern era, a study of mental processes. In order for this field of study to have any eternal value, it needs to return to its etymological root. As Lewis said in a Mere Christianity quote in the last session, psychoanalysis is not anti-Christian, merely Freud's personal bias. As apologists, we can embrace the findings of this and other sciences, both soft and hard, and assess them with similar rigour as we assess explicitly Christian texts. Lewis is careful to distinguish between Freud's professional expertise in psychology and his much more popular writings as an amateur philosopher. Lewis's first teaching job at Oxford was teaching philosophy, so he had the authority and ability to assess these culture-shaping texts and respond to them as a professional to amateur. When placed side by side, Freud's work and those of Lewis create a compelling debate, presenting both sides of the argument before a youth is exposed to one side only at university or in society, may inoculate them against the one-sided thinking which is so harmful to reasonable faith. Economics of oppression is an oversimplification which catches hold of people's best and worst instincts. People seek for justice and stand against tyrannous injustice. They hold fast to universal laws of morality and will risk great things in the preservation of them. This is as described in Book 1 of Mere Christianity, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. But these laws of good and evil are not unique to Christianity, and other systems can and have made use of this instinct for their own gain by inserting a pragmatic, worldly perspective in place of eternal values. This twists the God-given instinct for good to be an instinct for useful. Add to this diabolical democracy, as described in Screwtape Proposes a Toast, I'm as good as you, togetherness, being like folks, which is identified as envy, and we find a recipe for Marxist communism to sweep in and corrupt consciences until people actually believe that their demands for manifest and demonstrable evils are the ultimate good, and that opposition to their position is the ultimate evil. Thus we find the pro-choice movement, the LGBTQI-ABC-XYZ movement, and radical feminism, not the good kind seeking for equality, but the branch seeking subjugation of men and supremacy of women. A small fringe, but they exist. Marching hand in hand with Satanism and Islam against the church. In answer to this, some branches of the church have taken a very liberal stance to make them seem relevant to modern culture. I suggest that this is counterproductive. What the ordination of women says to the outside world is less, now the church is relevant to feminists, and more, now the church sees the irrelevance of the Bible. Preaching Marxism from the pulpit does not bring atheists into relationship with God through Christ, but undermines our own foundations. I suggest that the way that Marxism can be countered is to call its bluff and stand firm on the foundation of the Word of God. In conclusion, I will offer 3 ways to employ apologetics in this field. These 3 follow Alistair McGrath's thoughts in If I Had Lunch with C.S. Lewis. They are defense, commendation, and translation. Starting with defense. The Lewisian apologists of the candidate, at the pivotal threshold of their thinking life, would tackle the modern psychological or economical explanation for Christian faith head on. He would not answer a fool according to his folly, but he would offer good evidence to support his claims, such as the manuscript evidence, the internal testimony of the manuscripts, the external consistency of the events and times described in the manuscripts, and the case from creation declaring the glory of God. Psalm 19. He would then answer the fool according to his folly and show the self-defeating weakness of Bulverism, how it is circular by assuming the conclusion to prove the conclusion. It is a form of genetic fallacy by discussing the origin of an idea rather than the idea itself. And it is often no more than ad hominem, which does not deserve discussion or refutation. Commendation. He would show, like Puddleglum, that the worldview offered by Christianity, which can include eternity, immortality, infinity, and other transcendent values, is far superior in explanatory power and scope to the narrow naturalist worldview. For example, as humans we are inspired by the thought of an afterlife, but repulsed by the inevitable heat death of the universe. We witness miracles from the birth of a baby to healing of illnesses after medical science has given up. Science keeps churning up new ways that life is irreducibly complex, in a way that naturalism can't compellingly explain. Christian theism rests on a mountain of evidence. Naturalistic atheism rests on unfounded assumptions. Therefore, Christianity compels our faith in a way that other popular worldviews don't. And translation. The apologist might do this in parables, as Jesus did, or in improving stories, as Lewis did by writing the Chronicles. Or he might just tell it straight, as Lewis does in Mere Christianity and Miracles, depending on his audience. If he is like Puddleglum, then he will show that he is actually displaying the lordly/lionly joy and courage, regardless of his outward appearance. He will also show by example, not necessarily lead, but go alongside a pilgrim as he makes his progress. And now it's your turn. I'm going to offer a few preconceptions about Christianity. I would like you to discuss in what sense each one is true or false. Then I would like you to consider how you might challenge these preconceptions. Christianity is anti-gay. Pause and discuss. From the perspective of some LGBT rights groups who class any contrary viewpoint as being phobic, transphobic, homophobic, any sort of phobic, this could be classed as being true. Certainly the Bible uses pretty harsh language about the homosexual act in both Old and New Testaments. However, it is worth noting that the same language is used about gossiping. So I doubt very many people can stand in righteous judgment on this issue. What it does not do in any degree is condemn people who have feelings of love towards anyone. Indeed, this emotion is praised. The sole concern is with the act, as this is something that can and does do enormous harm to people who are made in the image of God. From the human perspective, the claim is false. Christianity is pro-love and pro-people. The challenge to this might be to ask if the accuser is advocating limiting people or pigeonholing people so that only one small aspect of their personhood is valuable. When they inevitably answer in the negative, we can follow by saying, we value the whole person, regardless of race, gender, social standing, or sexuality. Christianity is anti-science. Pause and discuss. If you've been following the Way of the Lion course, you will know that I hold this to be entirely false and the exact opposite to be true. Science, as we know it today, was started by Christian thinkers. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Sir Isaac Newton were all committed Christians, the latter dedicating his seminal work, the Principia Mathematica, to God, possibly the most important text ever written on mathematics. Many great scientists through the ages have become so precisely because they expected an intelligible universe. As Lewis puts it in Miracles, I quote, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. In most modern scientists, this belief has died. It will be interesting to see how long their confidence in uniformity survives it. Two significant developments have already appeared. The hypothesis of a lawless sub-nature and the surrender of the claim that science is true. We may be living nearer than we suppose to the end of the scientific age." End quote. Oxford professor of mathematics John Lennox, who actually attended lectures by C.S. Lewis at Oxford, claims that science itself relies on the accuracy of the Christian worldview to be possible at all. This statement, then, Christianity is anti-science, is false and fairly indefensible. A legitimate response to this claim might be to ask the questioner what they mean. Normally it will be something about evolution. If this is a loudmouth down the pub, then there is a strong chance that he won't be able to fully articulate what he means. But when you're engaging a thoughtful, educated individual on this matter, I would advocate giving them room to hoist themselves on their own petard. If they can actually express what they mean by this statement, then use the Socratic method employed by every toddler since Cain and Abel. Ask them why, until you have drilled down to the bedrock of their assumptions and beliefs, whereupon they should begin to recognize the hollow world they are constructing. Hopefully, this won't result in a transformation into a serpent. Christianity is anti-woman. Pause and discuss. It is true that the Bible sets out different roles, and expectations for men and women. Some of these stem from men being physically stronger than women, or the differing psychologies and instincts between the sexes. For some people, suggesting that there is any role that can be performed by a man that can't be performed by a woman is unutterably sexist and bigoted. Though there's a spectrum of belief on this issue, and some redress must be made for the late days for women being able to vote or control their own destinies, the extreme view I just described is very unhelpful to a fruitful discussion. In fact, the Bible endeavours to give women protection in a harsh world and entrusts women with awesome familial responsibility. God has, through history, treated women with great esteem, using them in positions of influence like Deborah and Esther, but applying the same moral standard to them, such as Jezebel. When God came to earth in the person of Jesus Christ, he spoke with women and men alike, praising Mary, for example, for attending to his teaching even though her sister Martha wanted her to be doing women's work. He healed men and women alike. He chose women to be the first witnesses of his resurrection, and he treated women, children, and men with equal dignity. His followers have, like mankind in general, made mistakes in the question of women, and it is good to see that being put right by the church and society, even if it has gone, in my estimation, a step too far in the ordination of women. Because of past mistakes, it is a subject that must be approached with care. I would advocate pointing to the author and perfecter of our faith for his example, since Christianity cannot be in essence something that Jesus was not. Jesus was not anti-woman, as I have just described. Thus, the religion that bears his name, Christianity, cannot be essentially anti-woman either. As previously mentioned, it is pro-people. Christianity is living in the past. Pause and discuss. There is some truth to this, since our foundations are at least 2,000 years old and can be traced 4,000 years before that, so we draw from the past for our future of necessity. Furthermore, some church traditions do have us shackled to outdated and outmoded cliches like organ music and Shakespearean language. But what of our roots? Is the Bible passé and redundant? Hardly. The Bible is the most up-to-date book that could ever exist, since it contains prophecy that has yet to be fulfilled. It also describes ways of life that countless generations of people have found advantageous when put into practice, and which modern psychology is proving to be valid, such as forgiveness being healthy and repressed anger being harmful. The next stage in the conversation could be to challenge them on how well their own worldview deals with morality, forgiveness, mental, spiritual and physical health, and a plethora of other issues on which the Bible speaks authoritatively. I've yet to find a competing worldview that can come close to the biblical model on a wide range of issues. Challenging an individual to use the same criteria to measure their own positions might shake them out of unhelpful thought processes. I have an example. I'm not going to give it to you. If you would like to hear it, then yeah, sure, we'll do that another time. But yeah, we'll skip that. Christianity is anti-progress. Pause and discuss. One can see where the questioner is coming from, and as discussed in the last slide, when I went to Israel, I heard the story which I relate to you without having fact-checked it. So I might be wrong. This is just a story I heard. It's illustrative. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is managed by 3 different denominations. They are so opposed to change and cooperation that I have heard that there is a ladder there that hasn't been moved for 50 years, as they can't decide whose responsibility it is to move it. I don't know if that's true, but it is a terrible example of brothers not dwelling in unity. The story is also told of the church whose pastor wanted to move the piano from one side of the church to the other, so moved it a few inches each week. So I have some sympathy for the claimant here. But the question must be asked, did Jesus act like this, and is it found in the Bible? On both counts, no. Jesus' teachings were notable for being utterly culture-busting. We don't always recognise this today because our culture and civilization is founded on those teachings, so we take it for granted that one should forgive readily and love freely and turn the other cheek and do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Note I said we should do that, not that we always do. Similarly with loving our enemies, we don't always do it, it is commanded. The radical nature of such teachings in a situation of occupation and oppression under the Romans should not be forgotten. To briefly jump back a book, this issue is addressed in Dawn Treader on the visit to the governor of the Lone Islands, one Gumpus. I quote, But that would be putting the clock back, gasped the governor. Have you no idea of progress and of development? I have seen them both in an egg, said Caspian. We call it going bad in Narnia. End quote. Much of our society has sacrificed good thinking and actions for bad in the name of progress. If we elevate progress to our highest good, it will, of necessity, take the place of God, and is unworthy of that position, since it is not, as God is, all good, but merely a side product of the passage of time. Anyone who has a fruit bowl, or indeed an egg, has seen that Newton's second law of thermodynamics is not something we should seek to direct our future paths. So, our learning aims in this session were to consider Puddleglum's refutation, which we did in an examination of chapter 12, including the stamping out of the fire, the disarming acceptance of certain things, and the argument from desire. Apply it to contemporary spells, which we did with reference to Feuerbach, Freud and Marx, and challenge some preconceptions about Christianity, which we did in the exercise section. If we have hit these targets together, then please consider liking this video. And if you would like to be alerted when part 3 becomes available, then please subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon. Next time, we're going to consider what Puddleglum meant by living like a Narnian. Until then, may we all find ourselves between the paws of Aslan.